Well, we're talking about what I'm calling now the threat of worship. We've seen the trauma of worship. Now it's the threat, not to us, but to the world. The gates of hell are not going to prevail against the advance of God's people. The advance of God's people preaching His word and doing His work. We see it sprinkled through this text. The testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. Out of His mouth comes a sharp sword with which to strike down the nations. He will rule them with an iron scepter. Those images that we find in Revelation, of course, are combining together imagery taken from the Old Testament. So, for example, if you go back to the book of Isaiah, you find statements like this: "But with righteousness he shall judge the poor and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. He shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall slay the wicked." The great messianic chapter of Isaiah, chapter 49, He's made me, the Messiah speaking here, He's made my mouth like a sharp sword. In the shadow of His hand He's hidden me and made me a polished shaft. In His quiver He has hidden me. You hear this celebration of the power of the Word. And that was really what we were considering this morning. But we want to add to that now this additional theme of the work, the righteous acts of the saints. The text says, interestingly, fine linen, bright and clean, was given her to wear. Fine linen stands for the righteous acts of the saints. And again it's repeated, the armies of heaven were following Him, riding on white horses, dressed in fine linen, white and clean. Earlier in Revelation, we find a similar theme. In fact, many times through the book, we find this theme. "Then I heard a voice from heaven say to me, 'Write, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Yes, says the Spirit, they will rest from their labors, for their deeds, their works, will follow them.'" And of course, that very famous statement from Jesus in the Upper Room Discourse, in which He combines those two ideas. He says, "Believe me that I am in the Father and the Father in me." That is to say, believe it because I say it. And if you can't believe it because I say it, then believe it for the work's sake. Believe it because the works that I do attest to the truth of the words that I say. And then He says, "Most assuredly, I say to you, he who believes in me, the works that I do, he will do also. And greater works than these will he do, because I go to my Father. Whatever you ask in my name, that I will do, that the Father may be glorified in the Son. If you ask anything in my name, I will do it." Those are verses that scare us a little bit, don't they? But I think it's safe to say, if we take the report of the New Testament seriously, that on this foundation, namely that you are the Christ, the Son of the living God, on the foundation that Christ is King, and that Christ has come, and through the weaponry of the kingdom, namely His word and His work, the gates of hell will not be able to withstand the advance of God's people. I don't know if you know it, but we're in an election cycle right now. And as much as we might like to think differently, I'm just going to break the news to you. The gates of hell don't give a rip about platforms of political parties, pontifications of political candidates, promulgations of legislatures, pronouncements of courts. The gates of hell don't even care. We have lived too long as evangelicals believing if we can just elect the right person, get the right person in the White House, the right person in Congress, the right person on the Supreme Court, then we can kind of push back the bad direction of our... Don't you even believe that? That ain't never going to make it happen. But the gates of hell shudder in the seismic shock of God's people in authentic worship, preaching His word, and doing His work. And I am here to tell you, history is literally brimming with proof of that proposition. This is a map of the world, color-coded. So you'll notice that most of it's red, but there are some conspicuous areas that are yellow. It's a map that's published annually by a German non-governmental organization. It has no religious ties whatsoever. It's kind of a German think tank, which is correlating worldwide poverty and corruption. Each year, it publishes what it calls the Global Corruption Perceptions Index, ranking nations around the world based on perceived corruption. Yellow countries are perceived as the least corrupt, that is, perceived by people who live there. Red countries are the most corrupt, as perceived by those who live there. I want you to notice the yellow regions. North America, the British Isles, Australia would be the ones that come most readily to mind as you look at the map, other little pockets of yellow here and there. Generally, the areas on that map that are least corrupt are those that you might call Protestant in their general history. And by that I mean they are secular governments in lands that have been decisively shaped in their history at some point by the Bible, but not necessarily by an official institutional religious presence. Well, if you look at the list, the very top of the list is New Zealand, down there close to Australia. It ranks a 9.4. It's the highest in the world. Netherlands, 8.7, not too bad. United States checks in 3/4 of the way up, 7.5, although we may be slipping. If you're planning a vacation anytime soon, I suggest not going to Somalia, 1.1. Well, how is it that the nations that rank highest on this got there? You look at Holland, for example, 8.7. The story behind Holland is detailed in a book that's entitled The Book That Made Your World. It's written by Vishal Mangalwadi. If you're not familiar with him, then may I modestly suggest you should be. He's regarded today as probably the leading Christian intellectual in the great country of India. He grew up in a Hindu background. He became a Christian as a relatively young man, eventually got a very respectable education, and now is working among the poor. He's like a modern Apostle Paul. He's been in and out of prison multiple times for his faith, working among the poor in India, while at the same time producing masterpieces of helpful insight, one of which is this book, which is my book recommendation for this presentation, in which he talks about Western civilization from the perspective of someone who's not a Westerner. He grew up in India. He's an outsider looking in, and he wants us to please understand the nature of the book that made our world, to wit, the Bible. And he's asking the question, is the sun going down on the West because we have so systematically jettisoned the Bible from the public square? And in this book, he does a masterful treatment of that topic. Well, in this book, on page 250, he tells a little story. And by the way, this book is well worth your reading because it'll give you voluminous numbers of sermon illustrations. And I know what it's like to be looking for a great sermon illustration. This book will give you a lifetime's worth of them. But on this particular page, he tells a story. When he was a young man, had only left India fairly recently, he went to Holland. And he was visiting with a friend there. And the friend said one morning, we need to go get some milk. They lived in a rural area, so they walked to the milk store. They showed up, there was nobody there. because the cows were milked by automation. And the milk was funneled into a refrigeration unit, and people would come and simply dispense the amount of milk that they wanted. There was an open cash drawer. And they would pay the money for the amount of milk that they had purchased, take their change, and go home. And that's exactly what this gentleman did. And Vishal Mangalwadi watched it all with stupefied wonder. And as they were walking back, he said to his friend, you know, if that milk store were in India, you would have taken the milk and the money. And the friend just shrugged and said, well, that's how we do it here. Mangalwadi says that on one occasion he was telling that very story to a group of people gathered, an international gathering, and as he finished the story, somebody in the back row burst out laughing. And Mangalwadi called on him. The man was a native Egyptian. And he said, if that store were in Egypt, you'd take the milk, the money, and the cows, you know. And Mangalwadi wondered, what is it that caused the people of Holland to live by an ethic so different from that which you'd find in India or Egypt? His answer is, and he documents this pretty thoroughly, it is the Bible. It is the Bible that teaches that God is watching. He's watching us. So how did the Bible become so influential in Holland's history? Mangalwadi's answer, the Heidelberg Confession, which became the vehicle by which biblical ethics and biblical truth was imported into Holland. The Heidelberg Catechism was published in 1563. It was translated into Dutch in 1566. By the way, this is a footnote. I see some of you taking notes diligently, fervently, and I do appreciate that. All of these PowerPoints are yours. So if you want to give yourself a break, you can have the PowerPoints for free and, you know, make use of them that way. So if that gives you any relief, I don't know if you knew that or not, but that's the case. So anyway, in 1566, the Heidelberg Catechism was translated into Dutch. There were 4 Dutch synods, culminating in the Synod of Dort in 1618, that mandated that pastors and teachers in Holland teach the Heidelberg Catechism to their students and their congregants. That this was going to be part of the curriculum. And so, for example, if you read the Heidelberg, one question is asked, this is question 110, what does God forbid in the 8th commandment? Thousands of Dutch children memorized this answer as part of their education. God forbids not only the outright theft and robbery, punishable by law, but in God's sight, theft also includes all scheming and swindling in order to get our neighbor's goods for ourselves, whether by force or means that appear legitimate, such as inaccurate measurements of weight, size, or volume, fraudulent merchandising, counterfeit money, excessive interest, or any other means forbidden by God. In addition, God forbids all greed and pointless squandering of his gifts. Question 111, what does God require of you in this commandment? Answer, that I do whatever I can for my neighbor's good, that I treat others as I would like them to treat me, that I work faithfully so that I may share with those in need. May I suggest to you that if we taught our children the Heidelberg as faithfully as the Dutch taught theirs, we'd probably be paying a little bit less for milk in the United States of America. Well, that was Holland. How about England? What made England a yellow country on that map that I mentioned a moment ago? If you had shown that map to people living in England in the 18th century, that is the 1700s, they would have been astonished. Because at least at that time, England's life, moral life, ethical life, had descended into a virtual cesspool. This is after the restoration of the monarchy in 1660. If you know your English history, you know that that reinstated kind of the Anglican Church as opposed to the Puritan experiment, the interregnum that took place during that 20 years or so. And everything just sort of devolved from there morally, so that by the time you get to the mid-1700s, it was a mess. The famous philosopher Bishop Berkeley said morality in Britain had collapsed, quote, to a degree that was never before known in any Christian country. The Enlightenment had had a devastating effect on the academic life in England by that time, by its dismissing of God, His law, His judgments, His very presence. The Bible was disregarded, dismissed as just another book on virtue. The church was basically shut out of public discussion of moral issues. Deists, skeptics controlled the culture, leading to rationalism, skepticism, atheism, cynicism. This was England, 1700s. With the descent of influence by the church came a rising expression of social evil, especially slavery. You probably know slavery was never practiced in England itself, but English shipping essentially monopolized slave trade around the world. The Treaty of Utrecht, 1713, essentially wrested from France and Spain a monopoly of slave trade. So slaves were hauled around the world, and about 95% of it was taking place based on British shipping. Well, that slave trading generated a whole lot of revenue, but the revenue was coming in a way that brutalized, of course, the lives of slaves and, by the nature of the case, the slave masters. It made labor undignified in England at the time. Slavery, in a sense, became in England the curse of the economic and political life in the English-speaking world, not only in England, but in the colonies. Millions of Africans were being hauled all over the place, a fairly relatively small percentage actually to the colonies as opposed to everywhere else, but we had our share. The slave trade bred a different view of labor in England. The Industrial Revolution, of course, created an engine of economic productivity, but those who generally worked in the shadow of the Industrial Revolution, in the mines, the mills, the factories, were working in virtually slavish conditions, basically hardly able to survive. There were tyrannical working conditions. Child labor was rampant and taken for granted. It was kind of a slavish attitude that had taken over the level of labor in England. And it was all driven, in a sense, by the greed that was generated originally through this slave trade. That affected politics. So corruption, nepotism, bribery dominated politics for half a century. The criminal justice system came to reflect it. Laws generally were manipulated to protect the elite at the top of the culture. Many capital crimes that might be surprising to us included stealing a sheep, snaring a rabbit, breaking a young tree, picking a pocket. You would hang for any of those. Executions were so common they were called hanging shows. Thousands of men and women were, if not executed, shipped off to Australia, which was their version of Alcatraz. And it's ironic, Australia became one of those yellow countries eventually. The flogging of women in public was commonplace. Economics was affected. British life was radically divided between rich and poor. It's no accident that Karl Marx lived in England sometime later, and most of the data that he collected in his diatribe against capitalism, called Das Kapital, was based on this time in English history. That's where he put together his case for his communistic vision. Children were the most tragic victims of this life in England. Mortality rates for children was about 75%. That is to say, most kids died before they got to the age of 10 years old, about 75%. Child abuse, including sexual abuse, was absolutely common, taken for granted. There was no child protective services. They never even thought of such a thing. The entire English-speaking world was affected. This is the mid to late 1700s in England. It had definitely affected the colonies. We can read in Jonathan Edwards, for example, his lament of how deplorable the ethics had become in America by the mid-1700s because of the influence that was coming across the sea. And then, oddly enough, something happened that reversed the entire course of the English-speaking world in a way that we could hardly have fathomed, imagined, or anticipated. And that event is called the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening, from a perfectly human point of view, was on the shoulders of three men. Now, there were many others, and of course we take it as a great expression of God's grace at work. But the three men who were the most central to this phenomenon were, first of all, this guy, whose name is Jonathan Edwards. This fellow, do you recognize him? George Whitefield. And this guy, you know him? John Wesley. Edwards in America, Wesley in England, Whitefield shuttled back and forth. He made the trip back and forth 13 times, preaching constantly, even on the ship. He was a preaching machine. Any one of these guys has a story that would be worth not just a lecture, but a whole weekend. I'm going to highlight, however, John Wesley. You may know that both Edwards and Whitefield leaned toward a Calvinistic theology. Wesley, of course, was Wesleyan. Duh. I personally tilt toward Calvinism, and so lest anyone think I'm stacking the deck, I want to celebrate a man who I regard as one of the great heroes of the faith, John Wesley. He was born one of 19 kids in 1703, the same year as Jonathan Edwards. He was ordained as an Anglican priest for the Church of England at this time when the Church of England itself had drifted into the most unspeakable kind of godless cynicism. But Wesley wanted to do something better. He actually organized what he called the Holy Club at Oxford, trying to discipline people into a more holy life. But it didn't seem to be accomplishing much, and the rigors of the whole thing seemed to be oppressive, till finally he decided to go across the ocean to America. He was here for about a year, thinking maybe he would do better in a kind of missionary status in the colonies. He was here, but it was a tragic time for him. He didn't feel like anything went very well. After about a year, he pretty much felt defeated and wondered if he was even cut out for the ministry at all. On the trip back to England, he came in contact with some people who were called Moravians. Moravians were Christian people whose history dated back to John Huss. John Huss was burned at the stake, 1415, Council of Constance. He's considered one of those so-called pre-Reformation reformers. And though Huss was put to death, the movement that he started continued. Martin Luther was originally called a Hussite, you may know. Well, the Moravians had continued now for some time, and John Wesley came in contact with them. He was so touched by the depth of their faith, by the fervor of their trust in Christ, that when he got back to London, he actually decided to go to a Moravian service. And it was that evening on May 24th, 1738, that something happened that gave rise to one of the most famous quotes in church history. As Wesley wrote later, quote, "I felt my heart strangely warmed. I felt I did trust Christ. Christ died for my salvation, and an experience was given me that had taken away my sins. Even more, I testified openly to all what I now felt in my heart." And at that moment, his life changed, and he became a man, first of all, of the Word. He began to preach But he would only preach in churches that would open their doors to him, and he became so odd so fast that very few churches were willing to have him come and fill their pulpit and preach. And so his opportunities to preach were rather limited. However, Whitefield came back, close friends, they both went to Oxford together. Whitefield came back from the colonies because he was on a fundraising mission. He was trying to raise funds to establish an orphanage in the colonies that would eventually become Bethesda. And so he was here to raise money. He met with his friend John, and he said, "Look, John, you need to rethink this preaching gig. Don't look at it as something that needs to be done in the church. You need to preach what Whitefield called open air, outside. That's where the action is." And Whitefield said, that's the only way you're going to get the gospel to the people who really need it. That is, the people who are living under the dark oppression of the present English culture, the people who are working the mines, working the factories, living in slavish circumstances. They're the ones that need to hear the gospel. They are not going to the Anglican church. John Wesley couldn't believe his ears. He said, quote, "I could scarce reconcile myself to this strange way of preaching in the fields, of which he, Whitefield, set me an example on Sunday. Having been all my life till very lately so tenacious of every point relating to decency and order that I should have thought the saving of souls almost a sin if it had not been done in a church." But in spite of his misgivings, Wesley preached his first open-air sermon in Bristol, one of those industrial revolution towns, April 3rd, 1739, and thus began an adventure over several decades that would change English history forever. He traveled 250,000 miles on horseback in all kinds of weather, danger, preaching everywhere he went. At the same time, he produced voluminous writings, commentaries, letters, tracts, and so on. Wesley was a man of the word, but my point for this presentation, he was also a man of work. He preached heaven, but he insisted that earth is God's gift, science is essential. Wherever he went, Methodist preaching houses would spring up. This was in Bristol, it was in Kingswood, London, parts of Scotland, Ireland. These Methodist preaching houses were called preaching houses, but they were also places where work was being done. Wesley's Benevolent Loan Fund and Strangers' Friend Society offered things like vocational training for the unemployed, no-interest loans for the poor, free medical care, food and clothing, medicine, fuel, tools for the helpless and the aged. Wesley preached against incredible resistance. The polite society of England ignored him. The church ignored him. There were continual attacks upon him that were never redressed. Sometimes when he was preaching in the open air, people would throw rocks and bricks from outside. More than once he was hit by some kind of projectile. He would keep preaching with blood streaming down his face. On occasion, they would take bulls and drive them into these open-air meetings to disperse the crowds. Sometimes little bands would be set up not far away trying to drown out his preaching by the noise. In other words, it wasn't all that easy as he continued this campaign. Nevertheless, against this resistance, which included both him, his brother Charles, George Whitefield, and many others who were becoming part of this campaign, they kept up this labor. The politically correct press of England at the time charged Wesley with terms like that Methodist, that enthusiast, that mystery of iniquity, that diabolical seducer, imposter, and fanatic. That was the kind of term that was used to describe him in the press. Wesley, of course, to his credit, always returned grace for that kind of abuse. His message was one of personal conversion. Mangalwadi gives much more detail on this than I have time to give you here, but Mangalwadi says in his book, quote, "Soldiers, sailors, miners, fishermen, smugglers, industrial workers, thieves, vagabonds, men, women, children listened intently in apt, reverent attention. Gradually removed their hats and knelt, often emotionally overcome, as he pointed these thousands upon thousands to God's grace. For more than 50 years, Wesley fed the Bible to drink-sodden, brutalized, and neglected multitudes." But Wesley was about more things than personal conversion. He was about the broader swath that the gospel represents in any given culture. He was also for legitimate education. He warned preachers could never be deep in the scriptures or thoroughly Christian without extensive reading. And thus he made every preacher who preached as part of his movement a seller of books at cost, and he required that his preachers know the contents of those books before they sold them. Encyclopedia Britannica says of Wesley, "No man in the 18th century did as much to create a taste for good reading and to supply it with books at the lowest prices." He taught practical ethics in his sermons. One of his best-known works was called Rules for a Helper. In it, he gave practical sort of axioms of conduct. One typical one was never be unemployed for a moment. Believe evil of no one. Speak evil of no one. A preacher of the gospel is the servant of all. Be ashamed of nothing but sin. Be punctual. You will need all the common sense you have to have your wits about you. He launched an attack against the social evils in England at the time that was breathtaking. He probably knew the life of the poor better than any prominent person in England in his age. And part of his sermons included preaching for fair prices, a living wage, healthy employment. Some of us political conservatives in the room might have been a little nervous in some of his sermons. He gave this warning: "Give none that asks relief an ill word or an ill look. Do not hurt them." But his most dramatic attack was on the whole institution of slavery in England. In 1778, he published a little work entitled Thoughts Upon Slavery. It was based on Genesis 4:10. "And the Lord said, What hast thou done? The voice of thy brother's blood cries to me from the ground." He produced this work 13 years before the English Abolition Committee was formed, which included people like John Newton, William Wilberforce, Lord Shaftesbury, and others. Many people would say the whole move in England to abrogate this trade in slavery began with John Wesley. The work was horrifying. It was a graphic, vehement, impolite expose of what he called the horrid trade, which he also added was a national disgrace. It was so over the top, polite people were incensed and horrified at the beginning when it was first produced. I want to drop to a footnote here. I believe personally if John Wesley were in the United States of America today, he would publish a book, but it wouldn't be Thoughts Upon Slavery, it would be Thoughts Upon Abortion. I believe that he would point out the 60 million American children who are not with us right now is a horrid trade and a national disgrace. And he would not only make enemies out there where we'd expect the enemies to be, I'm afraid he'd make a lot of enemies among evangelicals who are a little too polite to go there. But he was that kind of guy. And he won for himself a whole lot of enemies for a long time as he maintained this critique. He kept up his attack until the end of his life. The last letter he wrote was a letter to William Wilberforce, who of course is associated with the Slave Trade Act that was eventually enacted by Parliament in 1807. He also deplored colonialism. He said that the British war against the American colonies was stupid, and he publicly criticized the king for doing that. And the list goes on. In other words, my point here in all of this is the gospel he preached, while it was certainly narrowly focused on the gospel and personal salvation, addressed a wide swath of stuff that had infected British society at that point. And he made a lot of enemies, he ruffled a lot of feathers, but he felt that it's part of the content of the gospel to go there. That part of what Jesus stands for is a message that attacks the gates of hell, and he wasn't afraid to do it, and he did it with a vengeance. Public corruption in the church and state, the criminal justice system, all of these were fair game in his sermons. Many have seen that what Wesley did was restore the soul of England. He taught people to sing. His brother Charles, of course, famous hymn writer, wrote 8,000 hymns. We have sung many of them in your churches and so on. And can it be that I should gain an interest in my Savior's love? Well, you know that part of the wording of that hymn is, my chains fell off, my heart set free. And that was describing not only personal conversion, but for many people it was describing liberation from the chains of alcohol or abuse or hunger or poverty. He restored the foundation of England academically. It was Wesley, it was Whitefield, Edwards, who put the Bible back into the center, as it were, the book of books. You have to say of John Wesley that the impact of the preaching of him, Charles, George Whitefield, and eventually many others inspired a change in English culture that defies explanation or even what we could imagine. One man. He died at 88 years old. By the time he died, he was the most respected and beloved figure in England. Even though he had been hated and vilified over the decades, by the time he died, he was viewed as the most famous and impressive human being in all of English life. His picture showed up on every kind of trinket you can imagine. Beer mugs had the picture of John Wesley on them. I mean, he was everywhere as people lamented the loss of this great man. England left behind the 18th century, which was arguably it was certainly its most corrupt and embarrassing century. It entered the 19th century, which unquestionably was the century of its greatest glory. You have to say, how did that happen? And historically, sociologically, the only thing you can track down is John Wesley and the Great Awakening. After the Great Awakening, there was a transformed church. Both in England and America, you find these magnificent preachers who come on the scene following in his train. People like Charles Spurgeon, D.L. Moody, Finney, Nicholson, Ryle, Moule, James, and others. We find this renewed interest in the Bible that actually sparked what's called the Bible School movement. D.L. Moody founded Moody Bible Institute, and literally hundreds of others were generated over the time. He transformed politics. Wesley's work led to the conversion of William Wilberforce, Lord Shaftesbury, many other political leaders. The Slave Trade Act of 1807 owed its enactment to John Wesley, John Newton, Amazing Grace, William Wilberforce, others touched by the awakening. Other political leaders, including Edmund Burke, William Pitt, Abraham Lincoln, and others, openly acknowledged that it was the Great Awakening that stood in many ways as the inspiration for their own political understanding. Transformed literature. It's really impossible to imagine that authors like Charles Dickens, Sir Walter Scott, Jane Austen, the Bronte sisters, Robert Louis Stevenson, William Blake, Robert Browning, Lord Tennyson would have ever done their work in 18th century England. But in the 19th century, though not all of these people are, Bible-banging fundamentalists, all of them are writing in a culture that has been so deeply touched by a biblical ethic that now those works of literature make some kind of sense. Labor was transformed. Education was transformed. It transformed the church's vision of mission. William Carey, who's often called the father of the modern missionary effort, was directly touched by the Great Awakening. He was especially touched by a book written by Jonathan Edwards, which was a biography of David Brainerd. David Brainerd died in the home of Jonathan Edwards, being cared for by Jonathan and his wife Sarah. David Brainerd died before he was 30 years old, having been a missionary to native tribes there in the colonies. He died of tuberculosis. Many people would look at him and think he didn't get that much accomplished in that short life, and yet the biography of his life sparked the imagination of William Carey, such that he, who had just been a cobbler, turned his attention to the vast numbers of people in the world who needed to hear the gospel of Christ. He met resistance every step of the way. The first time William Carey stood up in his own little Baptist church in England and said he felt that God was calling him to go to India, an elder saint in the church said, "Sit down, young man. God can convert the heathen anytime he wants, and he doesn't need any help from you or me." That was William Carey's first encounter with church support, you see. And it didn't get any better for a long time. But today, William Carey continues to be celebrated in India as a national hero. There's postage stamps that celebrate his career and the great contribution that he made there. It was William Carey who said, "Expect great things from God, attempt great things for God." Missionary societies sprang up virtually simultaneously in England at about the same time following the influence of John Wesley, including Carey's Baptist Missionary Society, the London Missionary Society that eventually sent out David Livingstone, the Wesleyan Mission Society, the Church Missionary Society that sent John West to establish Red River, maybe you've heard of that, the British and Foreign Bible Society, the China Inland Mission, famous for Hudson Taylor. All of those sprang into existence in England at about the same time as a result of this remarkable transformation. There was a transformed social conscience in England. At about the same time in history, the Great Awakening produced the Salvation Army, the Religious Tract Society, the Pastoral Aid Society, the London City Mission, Mueller's Orphanages, Agnes Weston's Soldiers and Sailors Rest, the YMCA, the Young Men's Christian Organization, the Boy Scouts, the Girl Guides as they were originally called, the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. Thank you very much. All of those explode on the scene at about how do you do that? How do you engineer? Do you think any president sitting in the White House can make that happen? Do you think any Supreme Court justice is going to effect that kind of transformation? John Wesley transformed Christian hope. For you who have ears to hear, the Great Awakening refutes defeatist theology that history must inevitably spiral downward, just as certainly as it refutes Marxist ideology that says that history is simply the story of competing material forces. It stands for a very different proposition. Bottom line, John Wesley, George Whitefield, Jonathan Edwards, and others changed the course of history with nothing but word and work. They had no money to speak of. They had no political clout to speak of. They had no military armaments to speak of. All of the things that this world says you need to get stuff done, they didn't have. All he had was a Bible, a message, and a determination to speak God's truth into a dark hole that desperately needed it. Isaiah says, "But with righteousness he shall judge the poor and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. He shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth." with the breath of his lips, he shall slay the wicked. Fine linen, bright and clean, was given her to wear. Fine linen stands for the righteous acts of the saints. Well, there's our map. It's the most recent form. We still have a few red areas up there. But I submit to you that the words of Jesus are still true. Believe me that I am in the Father and the Father in me, or else believe me for the sake of the works themselves. And most assuredly I say to you, he who believes in me, the works that I do, he will do also, and greater works than these will he do, because I ascend to the Father. And whatever you ask in my name, that I will do, that the Father may be glorified in the Son. If you ask anything in my name, I will do it. And on the basis of God's people engaged in preaching his word and doing his work, the gates of hell shudder and are pushed back. I've told you this little story because you're in Christian ministry. You're pastors, you're Sunday school teachers, you're church leaders. You are people who have people under your ministry. I don't know but what someone in your world of ministry, maybe at this moment, is 8 years old. And that person may be the next John Wesley. For all you know, that person may be sitting under your tutelage right now. What are you giving? What vision are you implanting in that young mind? William Carey was inspired by reading a little biography of an obscure character that was reported by Jonathan Edwards, David Brainerd. And William Carey changed history. It's happened before, it can happen again. This is a time for Christian people to believe that God's word has power and that God's work is not finished, that we have this great opportunity to serve him. And my hope is that this time together this weekend, the presentations that have been made by all of these wonderful people who've here, and my modest contribution as well, will be a little bit of spark for each of us in the vision we have for the ministry to which God has called us. Thank you so much for your kind and gracious reception of my participation here. It's just been a wonderful time for me. Let's close in prayer and we'll be done. Father, we're grateful to you. We're grateful to you that even when we have a tendency to wring our hands, you have never, ever reached a point where you're desperate. Oh, Father, give us faith, give us vision, give us hope, give us confidence, give us that certainty that on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Let us be those people who join with Christ to bind a strong man, plunder his goods, take back what is rightfully the Lord Jesus Christ's possession, believing with certainty that he will reign until he puts every enemy under his feet, the last of which, death itself. For all of that we give you thanks, rejoicing in the name of Christ our King.